Good evening. I'm Derek Broman, and I'm the Acting Game Program Manager for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Thank you very much for tuning in live or watching tonight's recording on our second webinar regarding the latest draft chapters of the Oregon Mule Deer Management Plan. These chapters cover mule deer migration and fragmentation and economics and social values. Before I get further into today's topic, I'd like to share that we at ODFW are extremely passionate about mule deer in Oregon. Just like all of you listening, mule deer are incredibly important to us as a native Oregon wildlife species, a harvestable resource, and a flagship species for improving habitat quality that benefits not only mule deer, but the hundreds of other native species that also depend on those habitats. That said, this effort to update the mule deer plan is something we are taking very seriously. This endeavor is an all-hands-on-deck approach for the agency. The content shared to date is the collaborative product of numerous wildlife biologists, wildlife researchers, and other subject matter experts with combined decades of experience and using innovative research that saw us color thousands of mule deer to ground truth what's happening on the landscape. For example, for tonight's topic of mule deer migration and fragmentation, co-authors for that draft chapter include multiple researchers who specialize in analyzing wildlife movement, migration, habitat connectivity, and barriers such as road crossings. Tonight, you'll hear directly from the ODFW economist and social scientist who helped write the draft Economics and Social Values chapter, which is inclusive of values of all Oregonians. ODFW will continue to pull in internal and external experts to help in our goal in updating the mule deer plan so it best serves the entire public. With that, let's get started with tonight's webinar. As stated earlier, we will be discussing two chapters: mule deer migration, movement, and habitat fragmentation, and economics and social values. We will start off with a staff presentation and then finish with a Q&A session. If you're watching live, hopefully you saw that the notification to submit questions or comments in advance to increase the likelihood of being included in the live Q&A session this evening. We will be receiving questions live, but please recognize that we may not get to all of the questions received. You're welcome to submit questions afterwards as well. All questions can be submitted using the link in the YouTube video description below, or the QR code, or on our Mule Deer Plan webpage. Starting off tonight is a pre-recorded presentation from Dr. Don Whitaker, the ODFW Ungulate Program Coordinator, followed by Camilla Kennedy, the ODFW Economist and Human Dimensions Analyst. We've recorded these presentations in advance so that way we can minimize any technical difficulties. But Don and Camilla will be part of the live Q&A and, as always, are available for follow-up via email or phone call. So, Don, if you would, please proceed with your portion of the presentation.
Thanks, Derek. As Derek mentioned, it's very important that we get your feedback. There's many different opportunities and methods for you to provide your feedback. We would like you to use the form that we have on our website, either in advance or during this webinar. You can also email comments directly to the email address that's on the screen right now, and you can find that email address on the Wildlife Division page of our website. And as Derek mentioned, we're going to address comments later at the end of this presentation. The QR code is on the screen right here. That's the easiest way. It takes you directly to that input link. Tonight's presentation is going to follow this basic plan. We're going to do a quick review of the revision process for the Mule Deer Management Plan. Change it up a little bit from what Derek pointed out is we're going to let Camilla go first, and she's going to talk about mule deer economics and social values. And then I'll follow Camilla again with the mule deer migration and habitat fragmentation. Briefly, we'll talk about the next steps in the plan, and then we'll open it up where we can address your comments and your questions that might have been submitted so far. Briefly, the Mule Deer Management Plan process is been going on for over a year now. We started with some internal scoping early in 2022 and put this out for many of our sports group members in mid-2022. Beginning in January, we started releasing information a section at a time, and that started with the write-up on our mule deer herd range analysis coming from those thousands of mule deer collars. And then this is our second seminar covering the fourth and fifth sections of the plan. Our desires are to have a full combined draft sometime late in the fall of 2023 with a tentative adoption in 2024. You'll note that in tonight's webinar, these are the first of the sections where we're bringing in those very important issues and associated strategies for each of these sections. So from here through this fall, we'll be talking about what we think we can do and how we're going to get to the end product of improving things on our landscape for mule deer. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Camilla, where she can discuss the information about economics and social values related to mule deer in the state of Oregon.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to present an overview of the chapter on economic and social values of mule deer. But first, I would like to highlight why this is important. The application of social science through fields like economics and sociology can help us better understand the connections between humans and wildlife, as well as better navigate rapidly changing natural resource environments. This is commonly referred to as the science of human dimensions. Human dimensions can better inform us of individuals' knowledge, values, and behaviors. Economic and social factors are important to consider how people affect or are affected by resource conservation and management decisions. Provide a deeper understanding of the interactions and relationships people have with wildlife and their habitats. As touched on in previous chapters, there has been a decline in the number of mule deer hunters participating in hunts over the past few decades. Fewer hunters result in less funding for conservation and management efforts, as most funding comes from license funds and federal fund match that are allocated in part by the number of active hunters within the state. Looking into the numbers of controlled hunt applications compared to the number of available tags supports that this decline in participation for mule deer hunting specifically is mainly driven by a reduction in hunting opportunities as mule deer populations have declined over time. We can confirm this through review of historical number of first choice controlled hunt applications for Eastern Oregon deer hunts compared to the number of available tags, giving us a ratio of interest. This interest index shown in the blue chart is stable over the past decades. And when we draw a trend line across the interest index, we get a straight line, reinforcing that this ratio has been consistent over the years. In 2022, we saw a ratio of 1.71 first choice hunt applications per available tag. The key takeaway from this review is while mule deer hunters are decreasing, their overall interest in mule deer hunts relative to the available tags has been stable. Less hunter participation can have implications for economic contributions of the activity. We reviewed available data on related economic contributions. Economic contributions are the resulting economic impacts to regional economies from recreationist expenditures during their trips. The table displayed here shows findings from a 2019 study by Earth Economics that quantified the statewide impact of hunting and wildlife viewing in Oregon. When an outdoor recreationist travels to an area, they spend money on lodging, food, gas, parking, guide, and entry fees. That money ripples through the economy in the area and results in generated spending, jobs, income, and local taxes. For mule deer related recreation, it is notable that many of the areas that benefit from this spending are in rural parts of Oregon. We were able to estimate the amount of mule deer hunting spending in 2022 by adjusting the $96 day average hunting day expenditure from the Earth Economics study to $2022, and then applying this to the total of hunting participation days, which were 205,000 days across 37,000 hunters to come up with $23.3 million in spending. Additional research could be conducted to further estimate the downstream impact of that spending, as well as develop a better understanding of economic contributions of mule deer related activities such as shed hunting, photography, and wildlife watching. The total economic framework shown here displays all the types of values that go beyond economic contributions we just discussed. Use value is the direct use of the resource. It's the current use. Direct use includes both consumptive and non-consumptive use. For mule deer, this would encompass both hunting and wildlife watching values. The option value is the value in having the option to use the resource in the future. This is the value of future use. Non-use values, such as existence value, which is the value in knowing that mule deer exist into the future, and bequest value is the value of preserving the resource for future generations. Economists have valuation methods for these non-market values that measure the willingness to pay for the values. Adding up the willingness to pay for all of these different types of values together, we get the total willingness to pay. This is the value to society as a whole. Beyond just benefits, there are also costs associated with mule deer. They were examined in the chapter. Damages to private property and costs associated with management and conservation. We also looked in deer vehicle collisions, which result in direct and indirect costs to individuals and insurance companies. These costs include emergency response, towing, vehicle repairs, medical expenses. Given there are 6,000 deer vehicle collisions annually in Oregon, and the estimated cost per collision is nearly $10,000, we're able to estimate that these costs are approximately $58.2 million per year. For management costs and costs for population management, which include costs for population monitoring and program staff costs, these costs increase over time. Department costs tend to increase even when operating at current service levels due to factors outside of our control, such as rising healthcare costs and retirement and compensation rate increases. A deeper view at mule deer damage costs. Mule deer property damages include destruction of farm crops, lawns, gardens, structures, and fences, as well as public safety issues. We reviewed mule deer damage complaints in Oregon and found that there has been a trend of declining in annual complaints. For these complaints, when a property owner files a damage complaint, there is a section where they can provide an estimate of the financial losses they've experienced. While this data is not comprehensive in a way that allows us to estimate the total annual losses, we can learn a bit more about these costs. Reviewing complaints from 2014 to 2022, it was found the average loss was $4,471. Losses range from $80 to $60,000. The most common type of loss that was also most commonly associated with a financial cost was agricultural damage. Most complaints were resolved by ODFW and/or landowners. Moving on from economic to social values, a concept worth discussing and thinking about when it comes to mule deer management and conservation is the American wildlife values. These values are the type of wildlife values an individual has. There are four main groups: traditionalists who believe that well-being of humans should be prioritized over wildlife, mutualists who believe humans and wildlife live harmoniously and should have similar rights, pluralists who have a combination of traditionalist and mutualist viewpoints, and dissidents who are less interested in wildlife issues. The American wildlife values tend to be relatively stable over a person's lifetime and are impacted by a person's life experiences and belief systems. These values are helpful for engaging with stakeholders and better understanding American wildlife values and different perspectives. The table shown here shows the Oregon Public's American wildlife values in 2004 and in 2018. So we can see how the proportion of each of these groups have changed over time. Oregon, like many other Western states, has seen an increase in the portion of mutualists. While America's wildlife values tend to be relatively stable at an individual level, structural, social, and economic changes, for example, urbanization, can impact these values at a societal level. A better understanding of how people view wildlife can help with engaging and communicating, and human dimensions research work provides this type of insight. To conclude, the economic and social values of this chapter, identify two main issues along with strategies to address these issues. For both issues, there are efforts to pursue listed strategies. Issue 1, funding. Strategy 1, monitor department revenue and cost trends. Strategy 2, identify and review potential alternative sources of conservation and management funding. Issue 2, need for socioeconomic research. Strategy 1, conduct and collaborate with others on human dimensions research. Strategy 2, focus efforts to quantify economic impacts. That wraps up the chapter on social and economic values of mule deer. I'm going to shift the presentation floor over to Don Whitaker, who will be discussing mule deer migration and habitat fragmentation.
Thank you, Camilla. Let's visit a little bit about migration and habitat fragmentation. Simply stated, migration is the movement of animals between seasonal ranges. Migration provides a whole bunch of benefits to the individual animals that translate into benefits to the population. It results in better access to forage. It helps these animals escape their harsh environment during the winters of the high elevation summer ranges, and it improves the overall population fitness. Current understanding suggests that these routes are transmitted from the adults down to the females, from the does to the fawn, down from the females, the does, down to the fawns. As we pointed out early on, we've put a bunch of effort recently over the last 15 or so years trying to better understand what our mule deer do. We've had an extensive collaring effort that began way back at the South Central Mule Deer Study in 2005. Since that time, we've collared over 1,700 animals. From all of that information, we've found that across all of Eastern Oregon, about 58% of our animals migrate. That range of migration by herd ranges from a high of 86 and 94% on a couple of herds along the Central Cascades of Oregon. And then we have a small portion of our herds are on the north slope of the Blue Mountains in Northeast Oregon, where the proportion of animals that migrate is actually pretty low, down in the teens or as low as 7%. Migration distance also varies through herd ranges. The longest migration we've observed at this point is just under 90 miles or 140 kilometers. That's in the Crescent Herd Range in Central Oregon. We've got another one that's about 86 miles down in Southeast Oregon that migrated from Oregon clear down into Winnemucca, Nevada country. So our migrations are fairly variable and extensive across the landscape. Typically, the shortest migrations are up where we have the lowest proportion of animals that are migratory, and that's North Slope Blues and extreme Northeast Oregon. Length and timing of the mule deer migration, no surprise, it varies. Typically, our migrations average about 15 days in the spring. They add about 3 days in the fall as they're pushing in front of the snow, moving out of the summer ranges. This timing is very different than what many of the states along the Rocky Mountain front are observing. Many of those migrations will run 2 to 3 months. I think it's just typical of our country where the environment is slightly different than what they see up in those reported long duration migrations of the Rocky Mountain spine. An important component of mule deer migration is their fidelity to the routes and the seasonal ranges. Most scientists consider their mule deer migration fidelity to be pretty much extreme. We'll see in this series of animated images here where we followed a couple of animals across 3 successive years where we could look at their spring migration and their fall migrations. Essentially, mule deer tend to walk in the same footprints and they live in the same winter and summer ranges. Through time, We did see a little bit of variation during winter 2017 for this one of those animals where it was an extreme winter, and this animal actually moved late in the winter down to an even lower winter range elevation. Importantly, I'll go back one slide. Importantly, it's important to point out that the fidelity for mule deer to their migration routes and seasonal ranges is extreme, to the point where they will rarely deviate from this migration route, even when they encounter barriers such as fences or roads or highways or new development. We did see that there is some environmental influence on minor shifts in dates and stuff like that, but it's not that significant. From the migration information that we've been able to gather over the last 15 or so years, we've identified a number of issues that we want to talk about. Roads and highways, obviously, as Camilla has pointed out, is a significant one. Deer vehicle collisions are increasing. When these barriers are put forth, they will disrupt movement corridors and lead to habitat fragmentation, and this is increasing through time. Our first strategy is to use this data and identify those priority road crossing areas throughout Oregon. Strategy 2, where feasible, we want to work with our landowners and partner agencies to incorporate crossing structures along these highways where we know we can verify high numbers of deer vehicle collisions and high levels of use by mule deer. We also want to work with our public and private partners to develop resources to install and maintain these structures. They're not cheap. It's a very challenging process to begin, and we're currently working in that process. At this point, we're actively engaged in 3 key areas right now. The stretch of Highway 20 between Harper and Ventura. We're collaborating with everybody from Oregon Department of Transportation and the Burns Paiute Tribe and ODFW to try to develop some strategies there that will improve crossing of that Highway 20 along the Malheur River. There's a consortium been started, and they're evaluating and developing feasibility of working in the stretch from Bend to Subtle Lake, where we have high numbers of deer vehicle collisions. And then down on I-5, Southern I-5 down by the California border, we're actively engaged with groups down there to improve crossings in the skews across I-5. A second issue that we've identified through all this work is fencing. Fences are poorly mapped across the state of Oregon. They can be significant barriers to movement, and we are finding that fences are a source of mortality for our migrating mule deer and our resident mule deer as well. So from a strategy standpoint, our first step is to see what we can do to map and better describe fencing. We want to map the locations of those fences, and we want to determine what type of fence might exist in that location, because sometimes these fences are very important. They can be used to contain livestock. They can be used to protect resources from wildlife and livestock. So we need to know what type of fence they are. The second strategy is to work to remove unnecessary fencing. Where that fencing that was put on the landscape, in some cases decades ago, is no longer needed, removing that fence can provide a significant benefit to movements of mule deer. Thirdly, work to replace necessary fences with a more wildlife-friendly fence. There's lots of designs that will allow mule deer and other wildlife to move through the landscape with minimal or no impediment. Finally, again, we want to get creative and help develop some resources for removal and replacement of these fences. You will note that there's an absence of discussion on development and its effect on migration and movement and habitat fragmentation. Development from energy exploration, housing and urban development, and in some cases, climate change. These all can have an impact on migration and habitat fragmentation. We chose to not discuss that in this particular section because we have in the future a dedicated session to development, which will talk about all of these. Similarly, we will have a dedicated section to discuss the issues with climate change and its impact on mule deer populations and health. So we'll circle back around and close this with the fact that we're having this discussion this evening so that we can get input and feedback from all interested folks. We're going to address some of that feedback later. And so please provide your input to us. It's very important. We will incorporate as much of that as we can in our final stages. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions and or comments from those participating in this webinar, and Camilla and I will do our best to address those that we have time to work in. Thank you.
All right, well, now we are going to venture into our live Q&A session for the night. Mule deer plan management plan questions of all types are welcome. And we do keep track of all of those comments that come in through this webinar, previous webinars, and any emails that we receive. That said, tonight's conversation will be limited to the focal topics of migration and habitat fragmentation tonight, as well as economics and social values. So getting started, I've got a question for Don. So Don, we received a question from the public commenting that ODFW does a lot of studies, but this person doesn't hear about any solutions that are actually working. Is this management plan and the focus on fragmentation going to actually help mule deer numbers?
Thanks, Derek. That's actually a really, really good question. And whoever that asked that question is right. We do a lot of studies, but it's very important that we conduct those studies because it is actually informing our management and our choices of what we do. We can point clear back to the South Central mule deer study that was conducted between 2005 and 2011. That resulted in some direct construction of overpasses to benefit mule deer crossing Highway 97. There was 3 of those done. As we pointed out in the discussion, the movements of these animals is directing us where to focus our efforts on working on road crossings and helping animals where they're getting killed along highways and stuff like that. Habitat work, all of this information that we've been collecting is going to point us toward key critical areas where we want to focus our efforts and our research or our activities on habitat restoration and manipulation across our landscape for the betterment of our mule deer on the population. So yeah, I think the answer for all of the research and science that we're doing is our hope is that it indeed will help us improve our mule deer populations, both in how we keep track of them and how we make our management choices.
Okay. Another question that we received from the public. An Oregon resident commented that they are extremely concerned that solar fields and solar farms are being built at a very rapid pace. And in their opinion, those pose the biggest new threat on our diminishing mule deer herds. They want to know if ODFW can take the lead and be more involved with identifying these critical mule deer areas.
Another good question. First, I'll say that development of all types, as I pointed out at the end of my portion of this presentation, is going to be addressed in a whole lot more detail in a later section by our agency expertise on development. Taking the lead role, we're already actively engaged. We're participating in the BLM's programmatic EIS focused specifically on solar development across their lands in the entire state. I actually had meetings with folks today just on that topic. So yeah, we are involved actively. The information that we're collecting on our mule deer is critical to the decisions that the BLM will make regarding siting and permitting for all of these activities. So we're in the fight for the long haul, and we're using everything that we've been collecting the last couple of decades on mule deer to help inform what we do and where we and our partners can make our decisions.
Thanks, Don. And that's a pretty meaty topic, one that maybe we'll circle back on here and see if there's other questions that hit on those kind of collaborative efforts and issues to address some of those landscape scale conflicts. But I'll maybe throw one back to Camilla. So Camilla, based on your presentation and conversations that we're having externally, is it possible to estimate the economic impacts and benefits of wildlife watching? And if that's the case, if that's possible, how would that be done?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as an agency, we tend to be able to track hunting and angling very well because we have a license you have to purchase to get access to the resource. Wildlife watching can be much more difficult to track because it's what economists call a public good, where it can be difficult to restrict access. So we don't, for instance, sell a wildlife watching license. So we do have parking permits to access a smaller subset or certain subset of areas. But there are ways that economists can look into that and study what economic values come from wildlife watching. So we can gather data on site visitation and look at the number of visitors and take that, multiply it by the average amount each visitor sent to get estimates of those values. And one of the methods the economists use is called the travel cost method. And you look at what was the willingness to pay for those visitors in that visitor day. And you look at how much they spend to get to the site they're viewing wildlife. With this, you have to take precautions. You want to be careful for, say, somebody has a multiple purpose choice, their primary reason why they're participating in activity isn't wildlife. You want to account for that. But there is a brief summary in the chapter of different types of valuation methodologies and how one could think about applying those to looking at mule deer. And surveys and other types of research also, it's always valuable to learn more about different groups and who's participating in the activity and how many people are participating.
Yeah, and I imagine that's difficult because we have our historical information that feeds into our data collection, but there's new users, there's a full public that benefit from wildlife conservation management, especially mule deer conservation management. So that's kind of a new frontier, very clearly having some challenges of how to tackle those questions, but we got a question about kind of more of our traditional tools and techniques, such as when it comes to excise tax on guns and ammunition, and that being a source of revenue or ability to apply that to wildlife conservation management. So the question came in, why can't you just add more of those tax dollars or increase the taxes on guns and ammunition to help cover those increasing costs of successfully managing mule deer in Oregon?
Yeah, so with funding, it's very important to consider that there are different streams of funding, both federal and state. that are apportioned, and a lot of this funding has specific guidelines we have to follow. So, for example, a dedicated fund source would have restricted use. So there can be constraints to how funding can be spent. Specifically with PR funds, that stands for Pittman Robinson funding. That is money is collected on excess tax for firearms and ammunition. This is generated through sales at a national level, and then there's a process of apportionment to a state level based on a number of factors, including the number of unique hunters in the state. To use these funds, states still have to provide a portion of match. So in order to leverage these funds, licensed fund sales are still critical. So revenues from mule deer tags do help support species management costs, and fewer tags available mean fewer tags are purchased. So this would still have a downstream impact to program funding. As we pointed out in the chapter, that is a critical issue to consider in the future and think about, different pathways to find alternative funding, always monitor program funding, just because, there can be constraints with how you can use certain types of funds, and they're impacted by a variety of different things.
Thanks, Camilla. So going back to Dawn, regarding wildlife crossings, mitigating fragmentation, those types of issues, that's a really hot topic, not even just limited to mule deer, but mule deer are absolutely one of those flagship species where, especially we're talking about impacts to that species, but in addition, human safety, trying to reduce vehicular collisions, that type of loss. So if we're having all of this new information that comes in to identify where we've got these pinch points where migration and roads intersect, and there's a recognition that crossing structures are needed, why wait to put them in? We get a lot of feedback that people are hungry for these structures, and we're seeing that there's the need and a value, but why aren't these things popping up left and right?
Well, man, our publics are really thinking hard here. That's good. We're actively engaged with both the federal and state departments of transportation to try to get in the planning loop. That's the big issue here, is there's about a 10-year planning loop out from where these highway and road agencies can actually implement these projects. That gives them time for all the engineering and planning and site surveys, stuff like that. And it also gives them time to try to find the funding to do that. These things are not cheap. We, and honestly, ODOT and Federal Department of Transportation don't have the flexibility at this point to try to write a $20 or $30 million check to say we want a crossing here. There is some good news, and I think our financiers and our folks are watching the two big federal bills that have produced a lot of funding recently, the IIJA bill and the IRA bills. There are clauses in those that I think will have a lot of potential for us. We're also communicating and incorporating the information from our connectivity analysis that's just recently been completed too, so that we're trying to prioritize and work in a fashion that we're maximizing our benefits for as many critters as we can out there on the landscape, which is help us. We, as I pointed out in the discussion, we're actively engaged with lots of partners, and those include county folks, state folks, tribal folks, in some cases, cities and smaller communities, to try to work and find sometimes creative solutions to try to minimize the impacts we as people have as we travel the landscape, and the impacts we have on the wildlife as they're trying to travel the same landscape.
Yeah, complex answer, certainly. But along those lines, Don, so there's been some changes in recent years regarding implementation and modifications to a roadkill salvage program that the agency oversees based on some legislation from years past. how has that added to or perhaps changed our understanding of wildlife vehicle collisions? And if it's been a benefit to us, how can we focus our crossing efforts in the future based on that information?
Well, I think that whole program in general has been a benefit to us from a deer and elk and other large wildlife standpoint, because one, it is adding resolution to the data of where animals are getting impacted, and that's important for us to consider. So as that continues forward in the future, that helps us really tune up on what the hotspots are. We can combine that with animal mortality data, combined with the movements that they tell us they want to do. So that's going to help us a lot. And just as another side benefits, it's dramatically helped us with some of our information gathering for other issues associated with some of these animals, like diseases and wildlife health and a few things like that. Because many of that hotspot data came from Oregon Department of Transportation, where they picked those animals up. So the data we started receiving from ODOT went down, but the data we received from the location information on the roadkill salvage and vehicle collision points went up. So overall, I think it's a net benefit.
Thanks, Anna. And continuing on that pathway, we're getting a lot of good questions now about information on crossings and those types of structures. So folks, please continue to submit those. We're trying to add those to this live Q&A session. So please keep sending those in. We appreciate that. It's helping this dialogue move along quite nicely. So we got one question asking about the section on strategies. And the question is, do we plan on incorporating activities and tactics into the plan to dive deeper into specific metrics? For example, potentially consider having a tiered system of where crossings should be located, and to work with groups like ODOT to create a permanent fund for wildlife crossings.
Well, the funding part's a difficult question, and I'm not sure I can really answer that part. I do know that not the current session, but the session before this at the Oregon legislature, there was some activity there. So even our legislators are recognizing the importance of helping wildlife cross the road for lots of different reasons. And that's a simple but a very important statement. ODOT and ODFW and several other agencies and private partners are now actively engaging across multiple areas of our landscape. The funding part, I think that's going to be a billion-dollar question for quite a while. Again, we have to look creatively both with agency funding sources like the two bills I've already referenced federally, plus our non-governmental partners. They're very helpful with that. They're very helpful with a lot of our maintenance of some of the fencing requirements to direct and help animals cross that road. So we're actively engaged at all levels within the agency, from our districts clear on up to the headquarters here in Salem. And I think that's going to continue because we all recognize how important this component is for mule deer management into the future, and how it benefits all wildlife as well.
So maybe I'll give Don just a break for a moment. We even started to dive back into the funding, so I feel it's appropriate to bring Camilla back in. So Camilla, in your presentation, you mentioned, and in this draft chapter, that an estimated $23.3 million was spent just on hunting mule deer alone in 2022. Now, certainly there are other things factoring in, other activities. So the question is posed, why are the other corresponding economic contributions not listed and addressed in this chapter?
So, yeah, that is correct. In the $23.3 million estimate, that just looked at average hunter expenditure day, and we took that across how many mule deer hunters and how many days they participated to come up with that spending estimate. That doesn't get at all of those other downstream generated economic activity that can happen when they're spending in local economies. To get at that, you would have to do what economists call an input-output analysis, and then you would look more, we'd have to find more data on where the spending occurred, and then you look at, for those areas, you apply what's called a multiplier that takes the induced impacts of those spending out, and you can see how the money was spent. There's also something called leakage you have to account for when people buy things from Amazon. That money is not sticking in the economy, so there's several steps that economists do in this input-output analysis to get at the total economic impact that's generated. We did do our best to provide the numbers we could related for mule deer hunting, given the time and resource constraints we have. Overall, it was exciting to have a bit more fleshed out chapter on economic and social values, and we're glad to have provided that.
Good feedback on that. So we still have, I think, a couple questions coming in, some kind of relevant to the topic, others not, which we'll touch on in the near future. But while we still got some of those coming in and we get those well organized so I can ask them to you all, I wanted to give both of you the opportunity to try and give us some take-home messages based on the content in these chapters. What do we all need to know coming out of tonight's conversation, and what do we want everybody's help in disseminating to our peers, family members, other cohorts? Is there something that we need this viewing audience's help in spreading information on, such that they can help spread the word and get this information out there, especially on these critical conservation issues? I'll maybe let Dawn go first, and then Camilla can ask, and then I'll ask one more, I think, group question.
Sure. I think my take-home message for tonight, and honestly for the plan in general, is the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is trying extremely hard to incorporate all of the best science we've conducted in Oregon and all of the best science we're aware of, because we're fairly well connected regionally with the mule deer range, to help us get through what is, one, very complicated, and two, a very challenging process for mule deer recovery. It is not going to be easy. And it is not going to be short term. It is going to be very definitely a long-term process. Gains that we can expect to see from our efforts, the science tells us we need to do. Many of those gains are going to take a long time. It took a couple of 3 decades for our populations to decline to this point. We cannot expect a recovery in a short 2, 5, or 8 years.
That's a hard truth, but it's kind of a good message of patience, that this is why it requires an all hands on deck and collaboration with all sorts of partners, because it's going to take time and we need some patience, but want to keep people motivated and engaged on the topic for sure. Camilla, what are your take home messages or things that you want to help get out there so we're better educated and informed?
I think just issues that we're facing are tricky, natural resource issues. There's a spatial component. You think about the areas that are impacted, you know, and then there's a temporal time component, you know, so decisions that we make now impact generations into the future. And so I think that's a really important thing to think about and consider. One last little note too, on since we are advocating for social economic research, if you get surveys, definitely take them and take them thoughtfully, because that is one of the ways on the social human dimensions side of things is how we collect information. So if you get a natural resource survey, go on and take it.
Yeah, I see the value in that. So sometimes I begrudgingly say yes and answer those questions on the phone and go through the whole process, just because I know we benefit from it, so it's good karma to participate in those for somebody else to collect that information. We got one question for you, Camilla. So does the decline in, let me see, just industry plan. Oh, that one's there. Donna, we got a question about some riparian fencing and freezing to try to keep deer out of some of those tricky spots. Is that something you want to hit on without me providing a whole lot of context? I think you know what we're talking about.
Sure, and I think that's a really important question because that's one of the specific strategies that the agency is going to try to work toward, and that's getting a better handle on the fences that are out there on our landscape. We need to know where they're at. We need to know what type of fence they are, whether they're wildlife friendly or not, what the purpose of that fence for is, and whether or not we can modify it or remove it. So that rates directly into one of the strategies that we're talking about trying to doing. And again, it's not going to be easy. Many of those fences are indeed very important. They're protective of the riparian areas themselves in some cases from other reasons why they might be impacted. And they can help direct animals to areas we want them, whether those are wild animals or livestock. So I think that's a good question, and it's something that, again, at all of our levels, we're trying to look at and help. We can look at some of our grants that we're applying for and getting, you know, Hefner Country, we're getting fences solely for fence removal for deer and elk out there on the landscape. So we're working on it. And we're not going to walk away from it. We're going to continue down this road to identify, map, fix, and or remove or retrofit.
So along those lines, Donna, are there success stories from other states that we could look to for guidance and ideas on improving and protecting migration corridors? I mean, certainly what folks don't realize or may not realize is that, you know, there are so many working groups and networks across Western, you know, U.S., North America, trying to address some of the same issues. And certainly there are, you know, many meetings and collaborations that are ongoing that can help lend itself useful. So are there things that you've known, or are there models out there that we're trying to apply here?
Yeah, I think, and there's a few of them around Oregon. I can't name them all specifically, but that's where a lot of our districts are developing grant proposals or assisting with NGO volunteer opportunities and things like that. I think the biggest success model is for groups to form locally and take advantage of whatever resources are needed, whether those are just strong backs and vehicles and wire cutters, or whether that's financing and funding and grant opportunities. Develop those relationships locally because that's where the knowledge is. So from a migration standpoint, there's lots of examples I've heard about. I can't name them all specifically, about modifications, say, to fences, where groups realize this is a critical area of mule deer migration, and there's some information about the timing of those migrations. So if it's a fence that the issue is, they can go down there and they can lay the fence down during these critical time periods without removing it. Then they can come back in after the migrations have occurred, and if there's still livestock protect or containment needs or whatever, they stand the fence back up. And there's examples of lots of modifications to fences to go from a 4-strand barbed wire fence that's impermeable to babies to change it to a 3-strand with, you know, 18 inches off the ground and no higher than 40 or 42 inches, smooth wire top and bottom. We're seeing lots of success stories in Oregon, like the Highway 97 example, and other states where these movement corridors with all this new technology is pointing to some very, in some cases, very specific corridor crossing areas that we need to really look hard at. Some of those examples I circled in the presentation. Harper to Gentura along the Malheur River corridor. We know that's an issue. We're working collaboratively with multiple groups. We have a couple of areas also on our state wildlife action plan. Other states are doing pretty much the same thing. Plus, there's a whole brand new Western U.S. working group helping us with information exchange. We participate in it, and it's helping us with direction of resources and financing and information. Information is coming in at a pretty high rate, and we've got more people helping us take that information overload and turn it into things we can do out on our landscape.
Thanks, Don. And we got a question saying that somebody really appreciates the work that ODFW has done in collaboration with others on OCamp. And they're wanting to know if we could build off of that. And if we've ever considered starting an ODFW migration initiative, similar to other states that continue the active collaring of and research on big game. In fact, this person that wrote us comments that they perhaps recommend considering adding that as an additional strategy for this chapter. So obviously this question is for Don. Curious to hear your take on that recommendation, but if you would first, please, could you give us just a brief overview of what OCamp is, recognizing that's not necessarily your wheelhouse, but definitely you're involved in that large, successful collaborative.
Yeah, and I couldn't recite the acronym for OCamp, but as an example with how we're collaborating with OCamp and the conservation strategy, a great deal of the work being continued on all of this collar data is we have an individual here at headquarters that is analyzing all of that with the migration and mapper software. All of those corridors and stopover areas and seasonal ranges are being incorporated into the Migration Atlas, the U.S. Migration Atlas, plus all of those shape files and stuff are being fed directly into the server that OCamp uses and the connectivity assessment uses. So we're collaborating with them all over the place. We are continuing to take advantage of funding sources to address many of these issues that are coming from the feds. They've been very helpful for us here very recently with the Secretary Order 3362 monies that have come down, focused specifically on migration corridors and winter range work. We've received 2 very large grants for the agency, plus a number of other groups have received grants stemming from that action through the Fish and Wildlife Service site, because we have them specifically listed in our state action plan. So we're working at it. We're actively doing right now everything that migration initiatives are doing in the other states. I think realistically, I don't know that we necessarily need to label that we have a migration initiative. We just need the support to continue forward with the actions that we're trying to do in all of the various circles that we have and opportunities we have to try to implement actions benefiting mule deer and protecting these important areas.
Yeah. So I think we have time for maybe one last question. And we got one that came in for you, Camilla. So the question is that they want to know if you think that the decline in damage complaints correlates to the decline in mule deer, or is it due to other factors?
That's a good question, and it also does point out that when we look at the damage complaints data, even mule deer or any other species, there is some nuance to it. So one of our key performance measures from the legislature is looking at wildlife damage complaints, and we do have a section where we talk about factors that impact quantity of complaints, because certain things can happen and maybe that will increase complaints. For mule deer specifically and the information we presented, you know, there could be a link, but it's hard to say whether that is like causal, because there's other factors that could be involved, such as, you know, there could be an increase of tolerance for mule deer. So fewer complaints filed, or there's use of deterrence. So that's another reason why there may be less. So it's hard to say for certain. That's the key driver, because there are those other factors as well.
Yeah, thanks, Camilla. All right, well, it's 7 o'clock for those attending live. I want to be mindful of everybody's time. I think this is a good time to kind of close things up and wrap for the evening. So first off, I want to thank you, staff, and especially to all of those that are watching. Again, we genuinely value your participation in this effort to update the Oregon Mule Deer Management Plan, and we look forward to additional engagement. So stay tuned for additional chapters set to be released in July, with a webinar occurring towards the end of July or perhaps early August. As stated earlier, questions and comments are welcome at any point throughout this lengthy process and can be submitted via the link in the YouTube description below. So thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your night. Good night.